In this lecture, I plan to discuss Alexander's stay in Egypt and his proclamation as Pharaoh of Egypt. I mentioned in the last lecture that Alexander essentially laid claim to the position of Great King of the East, or Great King of Persia, Lord of Asia, in his negotiations with Darius, where a series of letters and apparently a full embassy was exchanged at one point, in which Darius offered Alexander half of the Persian Empire, and Alexander in effect said, well, I have that, and I'm going to come and take the other half. The victory at Issus and the captures of Tyre and Gaza allowed Alexander to enter Egypt in November of 332 BC. It was a remarkable crossing. He crossed the Sinai in about a week's time. That's about 140 miles of really tough desert. The reason he could do this is because he had a fleet to supply his army. And moving an army across Sinai requires a fleet. You just logistically can't do it otherwise. And that's why Alexander had to capture Tyre and Gaza first before he could move to Egypt. It was late in the season. Crossing in November, perhaps in early December, was one of the worst times to cross the Sinai. But nonetheless, he had to do so to secure Egypt. This brings us to what I always call Alexander's fourth and in some ways most congenial job. Alexander was born as King of Macedon. He succeeded to the position of commander-in-chief of the Greek League, the Hellenic League, or the League of Corinth. He now was claiming to be the great king of Persia, and shortly after arriving in Egypt, he would be hailed by several million Egyptian subjects as Pharaoh, to them, God on earth. And in some ways, that kingship was very, very appealing to Alexander. The arrival in Egypt, once you overcame the desert, there was very, very little resistance met by Alexander, because the governors in Egypt, particularly Matsakis, who was the satrap of Egypt, who was located at Memphis, the traditional capital of the Lower Kingdom, that is the northern kingdom of Egypt, where the pyramids are located, he surrendered in very little time. I mean, he just essentially marched his garrison out from the White Tower and handed over the keys of the city to Alexander. In the Upper Kingdom, that is in the southern regions of Egypt, the border zones, there were garrisons of mercenaries, but they felt no particular love for the great king. There was no fighting of any consequence. Far from it. The Egyptians welcomed Alexander as probably a Hellenic conqueror. They saw in Alexander a Greek, and in many ways, Alexander behaved as a Greek tourist and was just as bewildered and wondered and awed and respectful of Egyptian customs, traditions, and cults, as was Herodotus, who had visited the Nile Valley in the 5th century BC. This forces us to look at a couple of important points of Alexander's stay in Egypt. First is the relationship between Egypt and the Aegean world. And by that I mean not only just Macedon, but the Greek world, and why it was so easy for Alexander to secure his position in Egypt, as opposed to, as we shall see, the regions east of the Tigris, the Persian heartland. Second, the importance of Egypt will be underscored in its great agricultural wealth and its revenues, and also in its position in the Mediterranean. Alexander founded the great city of Alexandria at the far western end of the Nile Delta, and this was again to secure his strategic control over the eastern Mediterranean. And finally, we must look at this unusual event that occurred while Alexander was in Egypt, and that was the visit of the Oracle of Zeus Amun, the Oracle of Siwa, which is about 175 miles west of Alexandria in the Libyan desert. In fact, in some of the worst parts of the Libyan desert, would have been very well known to veterans of the Second World War as some of the worst countryside you would ever want to deal with, and certainly the worst desert to be crossed by the Macedonian forces until, the Gedrosian Desert in southern Iran at the end of the expedition. Well, first, let's look at the importance of Egypt and the relationship of Egypt with the Greek world. When Alexander occupied Egypt, this very, very rich province, an ancient kingdom, had only been back under Persian rule for a little over 10 years. And there is a long tradition of animosity between the Persians and Egyptians. The Nile Valley was regarded as perhaps the wealthiest land in antiquity. Herodotus, who wrote about the Egyptians in Book 2, and it is a marvelous book to read, more for Greek misunderstandings and misconceptions about Egypt rather than accurate information. But he does make a telling point that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, that the land of Egypt could yield 3 fabulous grain harvests a year, if you regulated the flooding of the Nile Valley. As I always point out to my students in the Roman Empire, Egypt fed the Roman mob. It was essentially the grain supply for the city of Rome for a third of the year, as well as fed a good deal of the Roman Eastern Army. So by ancient standards, Egypt was fabulously wealthy because of all of its food resources. And traditionally, the Greeks had arrived in Egypt to buy grain and other products, and they brought into Egypt silver. The Egyptians have no natural silver or gold resources of their own. They brought in products such as olive oil and the like, and there was always a brisk trade. Through the 5th and 4th century BC, as Egyptian pharaohs rose in rebellion from their Persian overlords, they could always find help from the Greeks. Many Greek mercenaries served in Egypt. The extent of wealth available in Egypt can be captured by a couple of reports. We know in 521 BC that King Darius of Persia reorganized the Persian Empire, and Egypt was taxed 910 Attic talents, which is about 6% of the royal income. At the same time, the Kingdom of Egypt, or the satrapy of Egypt now, sustained a huge Persian garrison of over 25,000 men at Memphis. It also had many other demands made on it, payments in grain, and without a doubt, it was the most wealthy province with the exception of Babylon and perhaps some of the Indian provinces. The loss of Egypt was really unacceptable to the great king in terms of revenues, and furthermore, rebel pharaohs in Memphis represented a counter-force to the great king of Persia. They were essentially rivals to the position of great king of the Near East. Another report we get is of a rebel pharaoh who was courting the Athenian democracy in the 5th century BC, and he sent either 30,000 or 40,000 medemnoi of wheat. That is enough grain to feed between 5,000 and 6,700 adult male citizens for a year. And this was a windfall gift sent by a rebel pharaoh in order to get an Athenian military alliance. So it gives you some idea of the potential of Egypt. It was home to many important naval squadrons in the Persian imperial fleet, in the Delta region, that is in the northern regions, especially at the cities of Tanis and Sais, the traditional residences of the late Egyptian pharaohs. Furthermore, the Greeks always had a high regard for the Egyptians and of their cults. They served in large numbers as mercenaries, and they had a Greek commercial colony still there called Naucratis, and in there was a Greek provincial elite who could cooperate and act as the translators between Alexander and now his Egyptian subjects. I said Persian rule wasn't popular, and there are a couple of reasons for this. The reports we get on the Persians in Egypt are not so much exaggerated as one-sided. We know in the repeated expeditions sent to conquer or reconquer Egypt that the Persian armies committed a number of atrocities. These were, well, I guess they're to be expected given the nature of the fighting. The Egyptians are almost xenophobic against invaders. There's reports that the first Persian king in Egypt, Cambyses, wounded the bull Apis, who is the sacred bull at Memphis, who is the animal of Osiris. And Osiris is a principal Egyptian god who is the god of the underworld, and the pharaoh, in effect, becomes Osiris after his death. There are reports in later expeditions of actual barbecues, apparently, of the sacred animals. And while the Persians, in my opinion, were not strict monotheists in the Zoroastrian sense, that's something that comes later, nonetheless, it seems to be that the Persians found the animal worship or the animal symbols associated with the Egyptian gods as particularly offensive. Second, the very elaborate rituals necessary to venerate the Egyptian gods really required a pharaoh to be in residence in Egypt, and this was not possible. The great king of Persia ruled through satraps and mercenary garrisons. The rule was always foreign and resented. There is evidence that the Persians repaired temples, that they did empower the traditional priests, but it was just not the same. And in the long period from roughly 405 BC to 342 BC, when Egypt was under independent pharaohs, there is a great deal of evidence to indicate that these last pharaohs of what represent dynasties 28 through dynasties 30 were very, very active in building temples, venerating the gods, and playing the traditional role expected of the pharaoh. And that stood in real contrast to the great king of Persia. When Alexander arrived, he was seen as a Hellene, and the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. Immediately, the rumor was put out that he was actually the son of the last pharaoh. Nectanebo, who was essentially driven into Cush, that is in Nubia, but the story was that he somehow got to Macedon and he was really with Olympias that night, or, if it wasn't the serpent and Zeus. It's a later tale to legitimize Alexander's position in Egypt. We do not have direct evidence on it, but there seems to be no doubt that in Memphis, Alexander was crowned pharaoh, that he took the traditional sobriquets of the various pharaohs. He was the son of Horus. He united the upper and lower kingdoms as a single ruler. He was hailed as the follower of Ra, as Osiris in death, and there is no doubt that Alexander respected all of the ancient Egyptian rituals. At the same time, Alexander at Memphis and later at the foundation of Alexandria at the end of 332 BC, the beginning of 331 BC, when he conducted games and festivals and rituals, there were essentially parallel events. He would administer to the traditional cults for the Egyptians, but to the Macedonian and Greek army, he held festivals and games in honor of Zeus Basileus, that is Zeus king, as lord of the Olympian gods, and he was quite comfortable with this, as most Greeks were. The Greeks felt that the Egyptians were the most ancient people in the world, that their gods were identified as equivalent to Greek gods. The story was put out very early that at one time the Greek gods, when fighting the Titans, had to seek refuge in Egypt. That's why they assumed the guise of different animals and to escape detection. And then when they got back to Olympus, they resumed their human form. And therefore, what the Egyptians are worshiping is nothing more than Greek gods in the disguises they assumed in that ancient mythological past. This is a process known as syncretism, but it was a remarkable compliment on the part of the Greeks of their acknowledgement of the antiquity of Egypt. And when in Egypt, of course, you venerate the Egyptian gods, but you don't renounce your own gods either. And the Greek attitude would be, the gods revealed them in a certain way to the Egyptians, they should be worshipped that way. They revealed themselves in a different way to the Greeks and Macedonians, they should be venerated in that way as well. This meant that, in contrast to the great king of Persia, Alexander, and eventually his successor in Egypt, King Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's boyhood friends and officers, and would eventually make himself king in Egypt rather than of Egypt, that they could perform the roles of a pharaoh and at the same time worship the Hellenic gods. And that was a major difference and accounts for this success of Macedonian rule in Egypt as opposed to Persian rule. Alexander conducted two other important actions in Egypt. The first was probably in December of 332 BC, shortly after arriving in Egypt and being proclaimed pharaoh. He brought his architects and engineers, particularly a man named Dinocrates of Rhodes and Crates of Olynthus, and these were engineers attached to the military corps who built all the artillery and towers and all. They were architects trained in the traditions of Hippodamus of Miletus, who is the man who I mentioned him earlier. He came up with the rational town planning of a Greek city. Following a group of oracles and portents, Alexander decided to establish a new city at the westernmost branch of the Nile overlooking the Mediterranean. And the city was to be called Alexandria. And in the Roman Empire, it's known officially as Alexandria ad Aegyptum. And the same is true in its Greek version. Alexandria was founded as a Greek city. It was not regarded as an Egyptian city or in Egypt, but it was near Egypt, is what the language in Latin Greek implies. It was laid out in a rational town plan. Serious work did not commence until early the next year, and they're still building the city well into the reign of King Ptolemy II. But nonetheless, Alexandria was destined to become one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean world. It would become one of the intellectual centers of the Greek world, and it was the second city of the Roman Empire throughout the Roman Empire, first vis-a-vis Rome and then later vis-a-vis Constantinople. The reason Alexander established it was, well, kings always establish cities, that's something they do, but in a way, Alexander was following a very well-established Greek tradition. As I mentioned, there was an early Greek settlement in the Delta, founded in the 6th century BC, where there was a Greek merchant community, and Alexander was able to get all sorts of technical experts from that community. It's known as Naucratis. And what Alexandria was a far grander version of Naucratis that would ensure the shipment of grain and resources from the Nile Valley to the Aegean world. It was also the strategic center for all commerce. It could be potentially a naval base, and it was perfectly logical to set up a city at that point. Furthermore, it was a stupendous undertaking, a masterpiece of Macedonian engineering, and down through antiquity, Alexandria was accounted as one of the great cities of all time. In the Middle Ages, there were all sorts of stories about how Alexander had to go and battle sea monsters, and there's this apparently glass device where he goes under the water to see what's interrupting the progress of the work. It was seen in the Islamic and even in the medieval Western tradition as almost a miraculous foundation, one of the great events of Alexander in constructing this vast Greek city on the edge of Egypt. And by January of 331 BC, the work was well in progress. The second great event for Alexander in Egypt was the visit to the oracle at Siwa. This is an event that has caused a great deal of discussion among historians, and that is because even in Alexander's own time, there were very, very mixed reports of what went on there and what were Alexander's motives. All of the historians of Alexander focus on this event. We get parallel accounts. They go back to eyewitness accounts. One of them is Ptolemy, who, as I had mentioned, ends up being king of Egypt, and actually a god in his own right. Also, Callisthenes, the great nephew of Aristotle, who is the official court historian and later clashes with Alexander over the use of Persian ceremony at the court. They undoubtedly participated in the actual trip out to Siwa. They wrote accounts. And then we have other musings by Plutarch and Arrian writing in the Roman age, and particularly raising the question of, did this oracle represent some kind of significant turning point in Alexander's own self-image, that somehow he was the son of Zeus, he was divine or destined to become divine? Arrian and Plutarch, writing in the Roman world, where Roman emperors allowed their subjects to venerate their spirit as potentially divine, they took the turn that this is probably a political move. They were familiar with the practices of the Roman imperial cult, and they weren't so they were so eager to accept the idea that Alexander might have thought he had some kind of element of divinity in him. On the other hand, when we discuss this in greater detail, there is an awful lot of information from the Greek world, and it keeps mounting, that the line between the divine and the human was never very sharply drawn in the Greek world. And that is also true in the Egyptian world as well, that it could be crossed. Whereas in Persia, the great king of Persia could never be considered as divine. That is a tradition that would have been antithetical to all Persian traditions. So that is one of the reasons why we concentrate on the Oracle of Siwa. We're told by all the sources who list the motivations that Alexander, once he had Alexandria well underway, early in 331 BC, was overcome by that pothos I've mentioned, this longing, this yearning, this desire to see something unusual, to exceed the deeds of his ancestors. The Oracle of Siwa was very, very well known to the Greek world. It was also known to the Egyptians, and as Pharaoh of Egypt, it was perfectly okay, perhaps even expected, that Alexander would, if not make a visit, at least send an embassy to the oracle to indicate that he was now Pharaoh of Egypt. The oracle, as I said, is an Egyptianized oracle. It's in an oasis. It's supported by date farming and the local water supply, but to get there is over 175 miles of very, very difficult alkaline desert. Therefore, when Alexander decided to go out to Siwa, it was a veritable military expedition. He took with him members of the companion cavalry, the Agrianians, the specialized light troops, the Hypasopists. He was accompanied by his closest friends. The fleet had to operate along the shores of Libya in order to supply water and provisions. And even on a route that was as well known as the route from essentially the Nile Valley to the Oracle of Siwa, it was a pretty chancy operation. We know that King Cambyses, the Persian king who had invaded Egypt in 525, 522 BC, who conducted the first Persian conquest of Egypt, that King Cambyses sent an expedition out to Siwa, an army, we're not sure of its size or its purpose, and essentially disappeared in a sandstorm. He never came back. And Herodotus tells us this is one of the incidents that made, Cambyses go bonkers and behave the way he did. And so there was always the danger of sandstorms and losing the way. And in the reports that have come down to us, particularly in Arrian and Plutarch, that apparently happened. In the course of crossing the desert at one point, they ran short of water. They ran into essentially a local sandstorm, the Chasmin, which covered up the usual markers. The guides got turned around. For 2 days, they were really hopelessly lost. And then miraculously, the way was shown by either two serpents, which is what Callisthenes claims, or what Ptolemy and others record, two ravens, that they showed. And the ravens are probably more likely. And then, in fact, what the guides did is followed the ravens, which knew where the water source was, which turns out to be Siwa. And apparently, there is a tradition still among the Libyans that ravens are a good sign, and well, that's logical. They'll head for the water source. Whereas the serpents were probably invented by Callisthenes as part of the. It's part of the tradition of Callisthenes saying that if Alexander will be remembered, it's because of my history. And Callisthenes is probably not known. Well, Callisthenes is definitely not known for his humility, as his own humility as a historian, and was not above exaggerating and inventing great anecdotes to make the history read well. Whatever it was, the ravens got him in the right direction. Water came, replenished the wadis, and they made their way to Siwa. Immediately, Alexander was greeted by the priests there. He was seen as Pharaoh of Egypt, but many Greeks had visited the oracle. In eastern Libya, there were a series of Greek city-states, notably Cyrene. These were Dorian colonies. They were linked linguistically and racially to the city of Sparta, and they had been there since the 7th century BC. And Greeks from these cities had made frequent visits to the oracle. They saw that the oracle was dedicated to Amun, that is the ram god of Thebes in Egypt, that is of the Upper Kingdom, the militant god of the Middle and New Kingdom pharaohs. They identified this god as Zeus because the ram, after all, was the symbol of Zeus. The oracle was held in very high regard. By the end of the 6th century BC, in the Greek world, the oracle was considered on par with other oracles of Zeus, notably the oracle of Dodona in northwest Greece, where Zeus revealed his will through the movement of the oak trees. And even in the Roman age, the oracle retained a very, very powerful position. In fact, the poet Catullus, the Roman poet Catullus, mentions it. He actually is ready to make a pilgrimage there in order to get over his love affair with his mistress Lesbia, and his marvelous poem which he writes about it. But it is an extremely well-known oracle, and so Alexander, representing not only Pharaoh of Egypt, but also a Hellene in many ways, was bound to go there. And after all, his ancestors Heracles and Perseus were there, or if they weren't, they should have been. So Alexander made the trip. And the oracle apparently involved a private session between Alexander and the priests. The way the oracle was delivered was as answers to very, very specific questions, and many times the questions would be rejected. There was a huge omphalos, which is a Greek word for a huge stone. It was studded with various jewels, particularly emeralds. It was carried by priests in processions, and we now have a papyrus text that tells us how this was done. And depending on how the omphalos, the sacred rock, moved and the gyrations, would give you an indication of the will of Zeus Amun towards the questions. We're told that one of the questions that Alexander apparently posed was, were the assassins of his father punished? This was actually something pretty important to talk about because there's all these rumors whether Alex was involved in the murder of his father. And the priest said, no, that's not quite right, that you should alter the question to, were the assassins of Philip punished? Now, this is a story that comes from Callisthenes, and what he's trying to drive home is that Philip, meaning king of Macedon, may not be Alexander's father because Alexander is really, from Zeus. Arrian and Plutarch are dubious of that. They didn't believe, they thought that Callisthenes came up with that, and that Alexander later on, when he exalted his position as a son of Zeus and he put on these pretensions, that it was all a move politically to win over the subject populations. On the other hand, it is clear that there were conversations between Alexander and the priests, that he had been greeted as a son of Zeus, perhaps in the widest sense that he is the favorite of Zeus. Some think this is a result of the Egyptian priests botching the Greek language. There's all sorts of speculation. When he came out of those private sessions, he would not reveal to his closest friends, that included Hephaestion, exactly what had transpired. All he said is, when I have returned home, I'll tell Mom. You know, one of the typical Alexander, I always said that something of a mother's boy in that regard. And since he never made it home, he never told Olympias. What does seem to have come out of these sessions was some kind of confirmation that Alexander was now in some sort of heroic world of his own, that he was matching his ancestor Achilles, his ancestor Heracles, that he was clearly the favorite of Zeus. And think about it. He was now some 22, 23 years of age. He had conquered the western half of the Persian Empire. Just several months earlier, some 4 million Egyptian subjects had saluted him as the god king of the Nile Valley. And there had been other indications, not only the Gordian knot, but many others we'll be discussing in an upcoming lecture, that I think that the visit at Siwa played some kind of turning point in Alexander's own self-image. And what that meant precisely, I will reserve for later, because that gets involved with other types of policies associated with Alexander's eventual, not so much proclamation, but indirect indication to the Greeks that maybe it would be a good idea to give me divine honors. That comes late in his career in 324 BC. When Alexander returned to the Nile Valley from Siwa, he found the Nile Valley very easy to order. There was a very well-run bureaucratic system going back to Pharaonic times, and it was essentially a matter of appointing Macedonians and Greeks loyal to him to run the former satrapy, the former kingdom. The man who was put in charge of running Egypt was a fellow named Cleomenes of Naucratis, that is a native Greek from the Greek colony. He was essentially made super finance minister. Another important indication is that garrisons were set up through the Nile Valley, certain key positions. Memphis, there would be a garrison at the future city of Alexandria. You had to put a garrison in the Thebaid, that is in the far south. These garrisons were entrusted to members of the companion cavalry, that is, men who had commanded an illa or squadron. It's another one of those indications that the men who commanded squadrons in the cavalry or regiments in the infantry were expected to assume higher command and administrative duties. They're all Macedonian nobles. There were also 2 senior Egyptians appointed to run the upper and lower kingdom from an administrative view, that is the civil administration. Egyptian laws and cults were left in place. And above all, the taxation system, most of it in grain, continued. The tax system will be modified under the Ptolemies, but apparently Alexander did not touch it. And in order to run Egypt, you really have to run it through the district magistrates. These are known by a Greek term, nomarch, and they apparently go back to an organization of the various, some 35 to 40 districts of Egypt known as nomes in Greek, and that's an organization system that goes back certainly to the Middle Kingdom. And therefore, for Alexander, it was quite easy to put all of this administration in place and to make sure no one would become too powerful. Now, when Ptolemy takes over Egypt in the division of the satrapies after Alexander's death, the first thing he does is get rid of Cleomenes and centralizes the authority of the satrapy under himself. And Alexander was very politic in making sure that no one had supreme control in Egypt. It was just too important. Furthermore, the army must have been in high spirits. When they departed Egypt in 331 BC in the spring, Alexander was marching east for what would be the final confrontation with Darius III. And he could afford to indulge that long time in Egypt and also expend the time on taking Tyre and Gaza, because he knew it would be a long time before Darius III could assemble another great army, and he was completely confident he could defeat that army and essentially capture Darius and win the war. The army itself, the Macedonians and Greeks, they had a great time in Egypt. There were festivals, Greeks and Egyptians. The engineers had a lot of fun mapping out Alexandria. And Egypt was an incredibly wealthy land. They were well-fed. They were well-conditioned. Discipline was kept. But the army must have marched out of Egypt in high spirits. They had conquered the most ancient land in the world. They had been greeted as liberators, as they had been in the rest of the Persian Empire. And they were now moving east, across the Euphrates, and into the upper satrapies to fight the great king himself and win the war.